On October 31st, 1999, in the dark, silent hours before dawn, a Boeing 767 carrying 217 souls vanished from radar screens over the Atlantic Ocean. There were no distress calls, no mayday, no warning, just silence. And then, in the cold water 60 miles south of Nantucket Island, one of the most controversial aviation disasters in modern history left behind not just wreckage, but a mystery that would tear two nations apart, ignite a diplomatic firestorm, and force the world to ask a question that nobody wanted to answer. Was this an accident? Or was it something far darker? You are about to hear the full story of EgyptAir Flight 990, the flight that should have been routine, the crew that should have landed safely, and the final 11 seconds of a cockpit voice recording that changed everything. Stay with me, because this story does not go where you think it goes. And by the end of it, you will understand why, more than 2 decades later, the truth is still disputed, still debated, and still deeply, painfully unresolved. Let us go back to the beginning. Not to the night of October 31st, but further back. Back to a time when EgyptAir was one of the most respected airlines in the Middle East. Founded in 1932, EgyptAir was the flagship carrier of Egypt, a symbol of national pride, a ribbon of connection between Cairo and the great capitals of the world. By 1999, the airline had been flying for over 6 decades. Its pilots were experienced, trained to international standards, men who had given their careers to the skies. Among them was a man named Gamil al-Batouti, a relief first officer, a man who had logged thousands of hours of flight time, a man who, by every outward measure, was a professional, and yet, his name would become the center of one of the most bitter arguments in aviation history. Flight 990 was scheduled to depart from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City on the evening of October 30th, 1999. Its destination was Cairo International Airport. It was a long transoceanic flight, the kind that required multiple crew members to rotate in shifts, sharing the burden of keeping a massive aircraft steady across thousands of miles of open ocean. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 767-366ER, a wide-body twin-engine jet that was the workhorse of long-haul aviation at the time. By every technical standard, it was a perfectly functioning aircraft. It had been inspected. It had been serviced. There was nothing in the maintenance logs to suggest anything was wrong. The passenger manifest was a cross-section of humanity. There were American tourists heading to Egypt for vacation. There were Egyptian students returning home after finishing their studies in the United States. There were military officers, 33 Egyptian military officers, to be precise, returning from training programs in the United States. There were families. There were business people. There were people with entire futures stretching out ahead of them. People who had no idea that the last thing they would ever do was board an airplane at JFK. 217 people in total. Every single one of them trusting that the machine they were climbing into, and the men flying it, would bring them safely home. The flight departed at 1:20 in the morning on October 31st. That small detail matters more than it might seem. It was Halloween, though of course that has no bearing on what happened. What matters is the time. 1:20 in the morning. The passengers were settling in, many trying to sleep through the long, overnight flight. The crew was going through their standard procedures. Everything was normal. There was no turbulence. There were no warning lights. The weather over the Atlantic was calm. The aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 33,000 feet and headed east, out over the darkness of the ocean. Approximately 30 minutes into the flight, Captain Ahmed El-Habashi left the cockpit to take a scheduled rest break. This was completely standard procedure on a long-haul flight. Pilots rotate so that fatigue does not become a factor. When the captain left, Relief First Officer Gamil al-Batouti took the left seat, the captain's seat. The other first officer, Adel Anwar, remained in the right seat. The 3 men had a normal conversation before the captain retired. There was nothing unusual. There was nothing alarming. The cockpit was calm, professional, routine. And then, at 1:48 in the morning, something happened. Al-Batouti said to Anwar, quietly and without any apparent urgency, that he wanted to rest now. Anwar left the cockpit, presumably to use the lavatory or take a brief break himself. And for the first time on that flight, Gamal al-Battuti was alone in the cockpit of a Boeing 767 carrying 217 people over the dark Atlantic Ocean. He was alone, and what happened in the next few minutes would become the subject of years of investigation, diplomatic conflict, cultural debate, and grief that has never fully healed. At 1:50 after midnight, the autopilot was disengaged. There was no reason to disengage it. The aircraft was in level cruise, far from any waypoint that would require manual maneuvering. The autopilot was simply turned off. And then the elevator control surfaces, the mechanisms that control whether an aircraft pitches up or down, were moved. The nose of the Boeing 767 began to drop. At that exact moment, the cockpit voice recorder captured al-Battuti saying something in Arabic. He said it quietly, almost to himself. He said, "Tawakkaltu ala Allah." In English, this translates to, "I rely on God," or "I put my trust in God." It is a phrase deeply embedded in Arab and Islamic culture, a phrase that Muslims say in countless different contexts, before eating, before a journey, in moments of fear, in moments of peace, in moments of prayer. It is not, by any means, an inherently alarming phrase. And yet, in the context of what the flight data recorder showed was happening to the aircraft in that exact moment, American investigators would eventually argue that it was the most damning 3 words in the history of aviation. The aircraft was now on a dive. The engines were at idle. The nose was pointed toward the ocean. Gravity was doing the rest. The flight data recorder shows the aircraft descending at a rate that, if uncorrected, would bring it into the Atlantic in a matter of minutes. Then First Officer Anwar apparently re-entered the cockpit. The door opened, and what followed was a frantic, desperate struggle. Anwar called out to al-Battuti. He said, in Arabic, "What's happening? What's happening?" He pulled back on his control column, trying to bring the nose up, trying to arrest the dive, trying to save the aircraft. And the data shows that his control column moved in the correct direction. He was pulling back. He was fighting for the aircraft. But simultaneously, the data shows that the other set of controls, al-Battuti's controls, were pushing forward. 2 men, in the same cockpit, with the same aircraft, pulling in opposite directions. One trying to live. One, American investigators would conclude, trying to ensure the aircraft hit the water. Captain El-Habashi burst back into the cockpit. He had felt the aircraft pitch. He had felt something terribly wrong even through the walls of the rest area. He came racing back, shouting, demanding to know what was happening, trying to help recover the aircraft. But it was too late. The Boeing 767, in a shallow recovery that lasted only seconds, briefly pulled out of its dive, the engine spooling back up as someone, possibly the captain, pushed the throttles forward and then plunged again. The final impact with the ocean was at approximately 1:52 in the morning. 33 seconds of screaming metal and terror and voices, and then silence. The wreckage was scattered across the ocean floor. There were no survivors. All 217 people aboard were gone. Within hours, search and rescue teams were on the scene. The United States Coast Guard, the United States Navy, ships from multiple nations converged on the area south of Nantucket. They found debris. They found personal belongings. They found the terrible floating evidence of a catastrophe. But they found no survivors. The ocean had taken everyone. The investigation that followed was unlike almost any other aviation investigation in history, not because of the technical complexity, though that was considerable, but because of the political and cultural earthquake that followed the preliminary findings. The National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, the American agency responsible for investigating aviation accidents in U.S. territory or involving U.S. registered aircraft, took the lead. They recovered the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder from the ocean floor. They analyzed the data with meticulous care, and what they found led them, slowly and then with increasing certainty, toward a conclusion that Egypt absolutely refused to accept. The NTSB's position, stated after years of investigation, was that the crash of EgyptAir 990 was the result of intentional action by Relief First Officer Gamal al-Battuti. The NTSB could not establish a motive with certainty, They are not a criminal investigative body, but the physical evidence, they argued, pointed unmistakably to deliberate pilot input. The elevator control data showed Albatutti pushing the nose down. The fact that the engines were brought to idle before the dive was consistent with someone who did not want the aircraft to recover. The phrase repeated on the cockpit voice recorder, called Allah Allah, repeated multiple times during the dive, was cited as evidence of intentional action, though the NTSB was careful to note the phrase's common usage. Egypt rejected this conclusion entirely and with enormous passion. The Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority conducted its own investigation and came to a diametrically opposite conclusion. Egypt maintained that the crash was caused by a mechanical failure of the aircraft's elevator control system. They pointed to the Boeing 767's design, arguing that a malfunction could have caused the control surfaces to behave in the way the data recorded. They rejected any characterization of Albatutti as suicidal or mentally unstable. They presented him as a decorated professional, a loving family man, a devout Muslim, a man with no reason and no history of any psychological disturbance that would explain such an act. The clash between these two positions became one of the most bitter international disputes in aviation history. Egypt accused the United States of cultural bias, of being too quick to blame an Arab Muslim pilot for what was actually a Boeing manufacturing defect. Egyptian newspapers ran front-page stories defending Albatutti's honor. Egyptian officials made public statements accusing the NTSB of conducting a politically motivated investigation. The families of the Egyptian victims held rallies. Albatutti's family, devastated by the loss of their husband and father, were then devastated again by what they saw as a grotesque smear against a good man's memory. And in the middle of all of this, the actual truth, the real, definitive, legally and scientifically established truth of what happened in that cockpit, remained out of reach. It remains out of reach to this day. Let us now look more carefully at the evidence on both sides, because this case deserves more than a simple verdict. It deserves the kind of honest examination that does justice to all 217 people who died and to the memory of the man at the center of the controversy. The case for intentional action by Albatutti rests on several pillars. First, the timing and sequence of events. The autopilot was disengaged in smooth air, with no mechanical reason to do so. Within seconds, the elevator controls moved in a nose-down direction. These two events happened in rapid, seemingly purposeful succession. Second, the control inputs. Throughout the dive, even as Anwar was pulling back on his side of the controls, the data shows Albatutti's controls were pushing forward. This is not consistent with a pilot trying to recover from an emergency. It is consistent with a pilot actively counteracting a recovery effort. Third, the engine throttles. Someone moved the engine throttles to idle before the dive became critical. Investigators argued this was another deliberate act designed to prevent recovery. Fourth, the repeated phrase on the cockpit voice recorder. The NTSB noted that Albatutti said "Taqal Allah Allah" 11 times during the event. They acknowledged the phrase's benign everyday usage, but argued that the combination of the phrase with the control inputs suggested a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. Fifth, and perhaps most troubling, there were reports, disputed, contested, and never officially incorporated into the final NTSB report, of personal problems in Albatutti's life in the days and weeks before the flight. American investigators reportedly looked into allegations involving Albatutti's conduct at a hotel in New York during a layover shortly before the fatal flight. The specific nature of these allegations was never publicly confirmed, and Albatutti's supporters argued vehemently that they were fabrications or irrelevant innuendo. But investigators took them seriously as potential indicators of a man under personal stress. Now let us examine the counterarguments, because they are serious and they deserve to be taken seriously. The Egyptian position on mechanical failure focused heavily on the Boeing 767's elevator control system. The 767 uses a system in which both pilots' control columns are connected to the same elevator control surfaces through a series of cables and mechanisms. The Egyptian investigators argued that a specific type of mechanical failure, a failure in the elevator servo tab system, could have caused the nose-down inputs recorded by the flight data recorder without any intentional action by either pilot. This was not a frivolous argument. Boeing's aircraft have had well-documented issues with control surface anomalies over the years, and the aviation world has a history of initially blaming pilots before mechanical causes were eventually confirmed in other disasters. The Egyptian investigation also pointed out that if Al-Batouti had truly intended to crash the aircraft from the moment he was alone in the cockpit, the sequence of events was strange. Why wait 12 minutes after the captain left? Why allow the first officer back into the cockpit at all? And critically, the autopilot disengagement itself, Egyptian investigators argued, could have been triggered by the same mechanical failure that caused the nose-down pitch. An aircraft that begins to pitch unexpectedly will often have its autopilot disconnect automatically as a result of the forces on the controls. The cultural dimension of this case cannot be ignored, and it should not be dismissed as mere politics. The NTSB's interpretation of the phrase "Tawakkalt ala Allah" was viewed by many Arab and Muslim observers worldwide as profoundly offensive. The phrase, in Arabic culture, is roughly equivalent to saying "God willing," or even a reflexive expression of anxiety or surrender to circumstances. Saying it 11 times in an emergency is not evidence of suicidal intent. It is evidence of a man calling on God in a moment of terrifying crisis, which is precisely what devout people do. The suggestion that this phrase was a suicide note spoken aloud struck many observers as a fundamental failure of cultural understanding, one that revealed the limits of the NTSB's ability to interpret human behavior across cultural boundaries. Furthermore, the mental health narrative around pilot suicide was far less developed in 1999 than it would become after later incidents. The aviation world did not yet have the frameworks it would develop after the Germanwings tragedy in 2015, when a German pilot deliberately flew a plane into the Alps, killing 150 people. In that case, there was clear documentation of the pilot's severe depression, his deception of his employer, his explicit statements about his intentions. In the EgyptAir case, there was no such documentation, no suicide note, no history of mental illness, no documented crisis, nothing that, in isolation from the flight data, would mark Al-Batouti as a man in danger of doing what the NTSB said he did. And yet the physical evidence is extremely difficult to explain away. The sequence of events recorded by two independent flight recorders, one measuring data, one measuring sound, is deeply, troublingly consistent with the NTSB's interpretation. The nose did go down. The engines did go to idle. The controls were pushed forward on one side, while pulled back on the other. These are facts recorded by instruments that have no cultural bias, no political agenda, no reason to lie. The Boeing argument, the mechanical failure argument, was investigated by the NTSB with significant rigor. They conducted tests, reviewed the aircraft's maintenance history, consulted with Boeing engineers, and ultimately concluded that no plausible mechanical failure could explain the complete pattern of events recorded on both recorders. That does not mean mechanical failure was impossible, but it means that the most rigorous investigation the Americans could conduct did not find evidence to support it. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in exactly the place that makes this case so uniquely painful. Two sovereign nations, each with legitimate standing to investigate this crash, each with access to the same evidence, reached diametrically opposite conclusions. Both investigations were conducted by professionals with real expertise. Both reached conclusions colored by the enormous weight of what those conclusions meant for the families, for the nation, for the legacy of a man, and for the broader relationship between two countries. The Egyptian families of the victims have lived with a particular kind of hell. They lost their loved ones. Then they watched as an American government agency implied that their loved ones may have been killed deliberately by one of the crew. Then they watched as their own government defended the crew's honor, but could never bring the satisfaction of definitive, legally established closure. There was no criminal trial. There were no charges. There was no verdict. There was only the word of investigators, disputed and counter-disputed across a decade of reports and press conferences, and diplomatic tensions. The American families suffered too, though somewhat differently. They lost their loved ones in what their own government eventually concluded was an intentional act, a murder-suicide in the sky. But there was no one to hold accountable. Al-Batouti was dead. There was no criminal trial, no civil trial that could function meaningfully across international boundaries in a case of this nature. Closure was something they had to build themselves, out of grief and time and whatever private faith could sustain them. Now let us talk about what this case revealed about the aviation industry more broadly. Because EgyptAir 990 did not exist in isolation. It was part of a larger, darker conversation about pilot mental health, about cockpit monitoring, about the profound vulnerability that exists when a single person has unchecked control over a sophisticated flying machine with hundreds of people aboard. In the years following 1999, the aviation industry's awareness of deliberate pilot actions began to grow. The EgyptAir case was not the first suspected case of pilot-induced disaster. EgyptAir Flight 185, which crashed into the Musi River in Indonesia in 1997, killing 104 people, was similarly attributed by American investigators to deliberate pilot action, a conclusion similarly disputed by Indonesian authorities. The pattern of disputed crash investigations involving possible pilot intent was becoming a troubling recurring theme. Then came the Germanwings tragedy in March 2015. Flight 9525, a Lufthansa subsidiary flight from Barcelona to Dusseldorf. Co-pilot Andreas Lubitz, who had a documented history of severe depression that he had concealed from his employer, waited for the captain to leave the cockpit for a routine bathroom break and then locked the cockpit door, disengaged the autopilot, and flew the aircraft into a mountain in the French Alps. 150 people died. This time, there was no dispute. The cockpit voice recorder was unambiguous. The digital trail of Lubitz's medical history was unambiguous. The world was forced to confront, head-on, the reality that a pilot could choose to use an aircraft as a weapon of self-destruction. After Germanwings, aviation regulators around the world responded. Many countries mandated the two-person cockpit rule, requiring that a second crew member, even a flight attendant, be present in the cockpit whenever either pilot leaves. This rule, which had been standard in the United States for years, was adopted more broadly internationally. New discussions opened about mental health screening for pilots, about the stigma of seeking psychological help in a profession where admitting weakness could cost you your career and your livelihood. These conversations, sparked in the aftermath of Germanwings, inevitably circled back to EgyptAir 990. Because if the NTSB's conclusion was correct, Flight 990 was a Germanwing-style event 16 years before the world was ready to fully confront such a possibility. And if the Egyptian conclusion was correct, then Flight 990 was a devastating mechanical failure that was misinterpreted by culturally limited investigators, and Gamil Al-Batouti has spent over 2 decades unjustly blamed for a crime he did not commit, unable to defend himself because he is dead. There is something about this case that touches a nerve far deeper than the technical and the legal. It touches the nerve of identity, of how we see ourselves, of how we interpret the actions of people whose backgrounds and beliefs differ from our own. The phrase "Tawakkalt ala Allah" is, in the end, the perfect symbol of the entire controversy. To American ears, in a context of crisis, it sounded like farewell. To Arab ears, in any context, it sounds like prayer. Neither interpretation is dishonest. Both interpretations are, in a sense, shaped by the lens through which the listener hears the world. Let us also take a moment to remember, as clearly as we can, the human beings at the center of this story. Because in the years of investigations and counter-investigations, diplomatic disputes and press releases, it is devastatingly easy to forget that we are talking about 217 human lives, and about a man's entire legacy, and about families who grieve to this day. Among the passengers was a young Egyptian woman named Rania Sharf, returning to Cairo to plan her wedding. There were Egyptian military cadets, young men in their 20s, who had just completed training programs and were going home. There was an American couple on their way to a vacation they had dreamed about for years. There was a child who had just learned to walk. There were grandparents. There were engineers and teachers and artists and dreamers. Every one of them had a name, a face, a story, people who loved them and waited for them, and who have never fully stopped waiting. And Gamil al-Batouti, born in Egypt, a man who had devoted his adult life to aviation, who had a family that loved him, who had colleagues who respected him. Whether you believe the NTSB or the Egyptian investigators, Gamil al-Batouti deserves to be remembered as a full human being, not a symbol, not a villain, not a convenient explanation for an otherwise inexplicable tragedy. If he did what the Americans say he did, that act was the product of a human mind in some form of extremity that we cannot fully understand from the outside. If he did not, if the aircraft failed and he died fighting to save it, then his memory has been brutally wronged. The NTSB's final report, released in 2002, officially listed the probable cause of the crash as the first officer's flight control inputs. Egypt has never accepted this conclusion. The two nations ultimately agreed to disagree, which is an extraordinary statement about the limits of international investigation and cooperation. There was no binding arbitration, no international tribunal, no mechanism by which one nation could force another to accept its findings. The controversy simply persisted, becoming part of the permanent record of unresolved aviation history. In the broader context of aviation safety, the lessons extracted from Flight 990 have been primarily structural rather than definitively causal. The aviation industry did not officially accept that Flight 990 was pilot suicide in any policy sense, because Egypt never accepted it and there was no mechanism to compel acceptance. But the case joined a growing body of evidence that the human element inside the cockpit remained the greatest single variable in aviation safety, and the one most difficult to control. The Boeing 767 as a type continued to fly, as it flies to this day. It was not grounded. It was not redesigned. The Egyptian mechanical failure argument did not lead to a redesign of any control system, because the NTSB found no evidence of mechanical failure to warrant one. The aircraft itself was, as far as the Americans were concerned, entirely innocent. There is a place at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, 60 miles south of Nantucket Island, where pieces of EgyptAir Flight 990 still rest in the sediment of the ocean floor. Not all of the wreckage was recovered. Not all of the remains were found. The ocean keeps its secrets with terrible patience. In a quiet way that defies the noise of official reports and diplomatic disputes, that underwater site is perhaps the truest memorial to what happened on October 31st, 1999. It is a place of silence and a story that has never stopped generating noise. When we examine the totality of this case, what strikes the careful observer most forcefully is not the answer, but the question itself. How do we know what happened in a cockpit from which no one survived to testify? We have instruments. We have recordings. We have physics. But we do not have the interior landscape of a human being's mind in the final moments of a decision, if decision it was. We cannot subpoena the dead. We cannot play back a human consciousness the way we can play back a cockpit voice recorder. And so we are left, always, at the edge of certainty, looking down into a depth we cannot fully sound. The families of Flight 990 have had to make their peace with that uncertainty, each in their own way, across more than 20 years of absence and grief and continued dispute. Some of them believe absolutely in the innocence of the aircraft and the blamelessness of al-Batouti. Some of them believe, just as absolutely, in the NTSB's findings. Some of them have simply tried to let go of the question and hold on to the memory of the people they lost, because the question has no answer that will bring anyone home. Aviation safety has improved dramatically in the decades since 1999. Aircraft are safer. Cockpits are more monitored. Pilots undergo more rigorous psychological screening in many countries. The two-person cockpit rule has become far more widely adopted. The industry has acknowledged, in the post-Germanwings era especially, that pilot mental health is not a peripheral issue, but a central one. These are real, concrete improvements that have made air travel safer for everyone. But there is a kind of safety that no regulation can fully provide. The safety that comes from certainty about what happened and why. The safety of knowing, definitively, that justice was done and lessons were fully learned. In the case of EgyptAir 990, that kind of safety has never arrived. The investigation concluded. The reports were filed. The diplomats exchanged their grievances and then moved on to other things. And the 217 people at the bottom of the Atlantic remained where they were, in the cold dark, in the silence that no argument can disturb. This is a story without a tidy ending, which is precisely what makes it one of the most haunting disasters in the history of aviation. The neat endings, when they come in aviation disasters, come from identified mechanical causes, from design changes, from regulation updates that can be pointed to as the transformation of tragedy into progress. Flight 990 gave us debate instead of answers, cultural collision instead of consensus, and an ocean full of wreckage that still has not told us everything it knows. Think about what it means to board an aircraft. You surrender something profound in that moment, a portion of your agency, your safety, your life, to a machine and to the human beings who operate it. You do this in an act of extraordinary trust. Most of the time, that trust is rewarded. Modern aviation is, statistically, the safest form of long-distance travel in human history. The number of accidents per mile traveled is almost infinitesimally small compared to automobiles or trains. The system works. Most of the time, the system works beautifully. But this case asks us to sit with the part of the system that is hardest to engineer, hardest to monitor, and hardest to protect against. The interior world of a human being. Whatever happened in that cockpit over the Atlantic on the last night of October 1999, mechanical catastrophe or human decision, it happened because there are limits to what any external system can see and know and prevent. That is not a reason to stop flying. It is a reason to keep improving. It is a reason to take mental health seriously. It is a reason to design aircraft and cockpits and oversight systems with the full complexity of human psychology in mind. Before we close, let us hear one final time the voices, however fragmentary, that the cockpit voice recorder preserved. Not the specific words, which belong to the dead and their families, but the shape of what those last minutes contained. A quiet cockpit, a professional crew, a long night flight over a dark ocean, and then, in the space of less than 2 minutes, a terrifying unraveling. A door opening. A voice crying out in confusion and fear. The roar of an aircraft pushed beyond its design envelope. The sound of men fighting over a set of controls with the ocean rushing up to meet them. And then, nothing. That nothing has lasted more than 25 years. It continues to last. In Cairo, there are families who still honor Gamil al-Batouti as a man falsely accused, who still insist on his innocence, who still carry the double weight of loss and injustice. In New York and across America, there are families who accepted an explanation that gave them the cruelest possible kind of comfort, the knowledge that someone made a choice, and that their loved ones died not from a random mechanical failure, but from something deliberate and therefore somehow, in the most painful way, comprehensible. Both griefs are real. Both are permanent. Both are legitimate. EgyptAir Flight 990 will remain in the archives of aviation history as one of its deepest unresolved mysteries. Not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the evidence was interpreted through frameworks so different that the gap between them could not be bridged. That gap is not only between nations. It is between languages, cultures, faiths, and the fundamental human need to make sense of senseless loss. In the end, what happened over the Atlantic on October 31st, 1999, is a mirror, and what we see in it depends enormously on where we are standing when we look. 217 souls, one ocean, and a question that the water has not answered and may never answer, and that we keep asking anyway, because to stop asking would mean accepting that some losses are simply beyond our capacity to understand. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion of all. Not that we know what happened, but that we are still, and will perhaps always be, trying to understand. And in that effort to understand, we honor, in the only way still available to us, every single person who was on that plane. So I leave you with this. The next time you look up at a plane crossing the sky, think for a moment about the extraordinary act of trust contained in that metal shape against the blue. Think about the hundreds of people inside it, each with a name and a story and people waiting for them. Think about the pilots in that cockpit, trained professionals carrying an enormous responsibility on their shoulders. And think about EgyptAir 990 and what it tells us about the thin line between the ordinary and the catastrophic, between a routine flight and a disaster, between a man going to work and a mystery that outlives him by decades. That thin line is worth thinking about, because understanding it, truly, honestly, humbly understanding it, is how we make aviation safer. It is how we honor the dead, and it is how we make sure that the silence after the crash is not the end of the conversation, but the beginning of one.